Do you think there was a real Jesus?
There might have been a real Jesus. It's certainly a reasonable hypothesis, but it seems to me not the most likely one. There are a lot of oddities in the record and a lot of similarities between the Jesus story and those of the myths of adjacent cultures at the time. And the whole life story of Jesus is parallel to what's called the mythic hero archetype. All the things that happen, divine annunciation, miraculous conception, child prodigy episode, later on the miracles, the demon exorcisms, etc., changing water into wine and so on, and gaining a huge following, which then turns on him. He gets killed on a hilltop. I mean, this is the standard thing that happens with him too. There is confusion as to where he's buried, and also with Moses and Elijah and so on. And there's post-mortem appearances and an ascension into heaven. I mean, how many times? The question is, did this occur several times, or did it occur even once? It seems to me once you see the type of story we're dealing with here, you really have the burden of proof on your shoulders to show that this one instance was historically real. And then that might be perceived as kind of a deductive approach, but I don't think it is, because it suddenly makes sense of the fact that virtually every episode in the Gospels can be understood quite easily, even compellingly, as a rewrite of some Old Testament story of David, Moses, Joshua, Elijah, and so on, sometimes in the same words from the Greek translation of the Old Testament that the early Christians used. When you look at the teaching ascribed to Jesus, what is not let's say what isn't explicit Christian theology, like in the Gospel of John, almost the whole thing is that the ethical teaching of Jesus parallels often verbatim sayings ascribed to the rabbis or to contemporary Stoics and Cynics. And in these literatures also you have sayings attributed to several different people, as if nobody could keep straight who had said it and just figured, well, this would fit if Socrates or Diogenes or Jesus said it, and so voila, he did. So I like to say that though there may have been a historical Jesus, there isn't one anymore. We don't know if or who or what he was like. And you can see this especially comparing the shelves full of historical Jesus books by critical scholars who think that, oh yeah, a lot of it's myth and legend and secondary embellishment, but when you whittle it down to the real core of it, Jesus was like this. But it's anybody's guess as to what the core of the tradition is, if there is one, and I tend to think there is not. But the point is that with all of these scholarly attempts, it's an embarrassment of riches. Jesus can't have been all these different figures, so which one, if any, was he?
Well, films like Zeitgeist and others are really eager, and people on the internet, activists and well-meaning historians who see the references are eager to make a Horus connection, a Mithras connection. Oh look, he was ripped off from these earlier gods. Do you have a perspective, or have you done research on, did they just rip Jesus off from Hercules and that kind of thing?
Well, the problem there, some of these don't have very extensive parallels, like Mithras is, early Christianity does parallel Mithraism in some important respects, but the Mithraic story is not that similar. Mithras doesn't die and rise. Some say, oh, he was crucified too and had 12 disciples. I don't think there's any evidence for that. So they're going overboard. He died and was reborn with the solstice and all of that. That's not quite the same story, but there are closer parallels with Attis, Adonis, Osiris, Tammuz, and even Hercules. The thing that is the major problem with that claim is it's pejorative. You wouldn't speak, scholars would not speak of Christians ripping this stuff off as if it was some kind of conspiracy. That's just kind of non-historical thinking. That's not how, I mean, occasionally we do know of people inventing gods. We're told that, in Lucian of Samosata's satire, Alexander the Quack Prophet, he speaks of a guy creating a god with an oracle god that was a big snake with a white linen mask that whose mouth he could manipulate like a puppet, and he would have a line of people coming into the tent with questions to ask him, and it was just a big ripoff. He sent out apostles and brought in all sorts of people, but we don't really know how much this is really true and how much is just ridicule, but let's assume it was true. All right, there's a case of somebody founding a cult, creating a god. One of the Ptolemaic emperors in Egypt in Hellenistic times kind of created a god, Serapis, by combining two earlier Egyptian gods, and that became very famous. So it could happen, but I don't really see any evidence for that in Christianity. It seems more likely to me it's just a slow evolution of various myths that are already similar and have similar origins in agricultural mythology and stuff, that these come together eventually and they get historicized in this case because the bishops, well, I guess they wouldn't have been the only ones, but the one that we will know as Catholic bishops decided that they could get a kind of a lock on the authorities speaking for Jesus by saying, well, he was a historical founder, and a couple of generations back, our teachers were taught by his disciples. This seemed to give more authenticity than various other Gnostic and other mystical Christians that said that they got their revelations from Jesus in visions. Well, there's no control over that. That could just be any kind of hallucination. And so they said, no, we got it right from the horse's mouth. And I think that is what happened there. And you could say that was a bit of a scheme, but that's later in the day, and not all Christians believed that. There certainly has been priestcraft here and there, but I think it's a legitimate natural growth, just like that of the other ones, the Osiris cult and so on. Nobody cooked that up. An ancient religion evolved into it.
Bob, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and why are so many apologists just sort of standing upon them as sort of pillars of the proof of Christ? And for the layperson, what are they? Where were they found? What do they do?
I believe it was 1947 when a shepherd boy accidentally, I think he was pursuing a goat that had run off from the herd, and he wanted to see if the goat was in this one of several caves by the Dead Sea. And to save himself time, he picked up a rock and tossed it in, figured it would scare the goat out. Instead, he heard a shattering noise and found there were a bunch of clay jars that had old scrolls in them, some just patches and postage stamp size fragments, but some entirely intact books, and it took a long time for these to be translated and published. In fact, about a quarter of them were only published about 20 years ago, and they really created what some called Qumran fever, because Qumran was the site of the discovery in Israel. And there was an immediate flurry of questions and attempts at answers. Who wrote these things? Well, we knew from ancient writers that more or less in that area there had been a monastic group called the Essenes, Jews who were ultra pious and had split off from the people that later became the Pharisees. Well, most people figure it was the Essenes that wrote these things. We don't know, though. It could have been other groups. There were many groups we don't know much about, but their names. There are copies of different scriptural Old Testament books in Hebrew there, and I'd say the major sure discovery there was that we suddenly had Hebrew copies of I think every Old Testament book except Esther, it's kind of a minor one, that were about 1,000 years earlier than the ones we had before that, which were medieval so-called Masoretic text copies. And Jewish scribes and monks had been copying them, but over that long a period you're going to have errors and so on. And this enabled us to see how far astray they had gone, and it turned out not very. It showed that, like we already had the Samaritan Pentateuch, a different kind of Hebrew for just the first 5 books. We had the Greek Septuagint, so-called, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and you could kind of tell that they were working from a Hebrew text that was a bit different from the Masoretic text. And so here's our chance to do a core sample. And it turned out that all of the different, only slightly different text families, Samaritan, Greek, Hebrew, were represented in these ancient copies. You could see that they all sort of evolved in different directions from an earlier type. And a lot of apologists are interested in the scrolls because it does refute the notion one sometimes hears that the Bible was just randomly altered over the years so that we have no idea what it originally said. That was sort of a hysterical, that's another conspiracy theory kind of that was well banished. Of course, the real problem is, as Old Testament scholars have known for a long time, what was changed before these books were written down in the form we have in the Jewish canon. Like, what was the prehistory of the text? These people were concerned about the post-history. Had it been all messed up in the intervening centuries? Well, apparently no, it had not to any great degree. But before that, before they canonized them, how were they different? And it wasn't all that much help in determining that. You really have to go from internal indications. Does it look like something interrupts the story here? If it does, maybe it's been added. But it didn't make a whole lot of difference. I guess it did help dispel that one silly story. In the same way you hear people say that at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the bishops decided what would be in the New Testament. That's not true. I mean, the real fact of the matter is quite interesting in its own right, but that's not true. That wasn't one of the things discussed there, but you hear it as a sort of an urban legend thing. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls also gave us the library of some Jewish sect, again, possibly the Essenes. It wasn't just their copies of the Bible, but there are loads of other things that are biblical type books written in the name of ancient Bible characters, and hence they're called pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigraphy is a pseudonymous authorship. Books attributed to Enoch and Moses and Baruch and other people. Copies of some of these had survived over the years too, but here were early Hebrew copies of them, and it really made clear that there were a lot of different kinds of Judaism back there, and the scrolls come from around the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, but they probably represent a couple of centuries worth of these writings, and it's impossible to date them very closely, even with carbon dating. But some think they go back to the time of Judah Maccabee and the Hasmoneans fighting off the Seleucid Syrians and so on, which would be about the 2nd century BCE. There is no name of anybody in the scrolls. There are references to the wicked priest and the spouter of lies and the teacher of righteousness, and the teacher was ambushed by these other guys and he was killed, but one day he'll come back in judgment. And so a lot of the speculation was, well, was the teacher of righteousness John the Baptist maybe, or was it Jesus? It must have been somebody important. And that is still going on. It's a legitimate question. Barbara Thiering, in a bunch of books, has argued that John the Baptist was the teacher of righteousness. And there were a lot of common things between the Dead Sea Scrolls group and the John the Baptist sect, including daily baptism. There are people that say I don't think there are any real scholars that say it was Jesus anymore, but Robert Eisenman argues very effectively that the teacher of righteousness was James the Just, who tradition makes the brother of Jesus. And there are a lot of interesting questions raised, and I tend to go with Eisenman on that. I think Paul is the villain, the spouter of lies and all that, but it is all in code, so we don't really know. So there are really tantalizing questions in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not too much in the way of answers, but it does at least show us how diverse Judaism was, and also how many items in the New Testament, terminology, church organization, and so forth, were part of Judaism generally. They had bishops and baptism and communal living arrangements and so forth. So it sheds a lot of light, but not anything apologists should be all that either upset about or rejoicing over.
So it's not the smoking gun. This
No.
proves the Old Testament because in some way, there's none of that.
Well, in one way, in that it does really put to rest the idea that there was just haphazard or intentional wild distortion of the Old Testament. That's pretty clear that it wasn't. I mean, if like Isaiah, there are 2 or 3 copies of Isaiah, one of them complete, and that's a big book. Okay, there's a gap of some hundreds of years, but there's no particular reason to posit that it had been changed drastically before the time we got it. So it does, I think, I mean, if it had been radically different, then you would have had to say, geez, we really don't know what it originally said, but I think they put that doubt to rest.
Josephus was, 100 years after the supposed birth of Christ? And what's your take on Josephus? I hear his name bandied about all the time, and I want to address it on video.
Josephus, who is often discussed by apologists and scholars, New Testament historians, was a very important figure. He wrote around 90 AD, or CE if you prefer, and he wrote a couple of major books, Wars of the Jews and Antiquities of the Jews. And then a couple of other ones. He did an autobiography and polemical work against another historian and so forth. Well, he had been a commander of Jewish troops against the Romans in the Roman-Jewish War around 66 to 73 AD. But it was pretty obvious who was going to win, and he decided to switch sides and join the Romans, and which is why he's considered a villain by Jews today, and I guess he probably was, but we owe him a great debt because he told us an awful lot about the whole Middle East and its political history from a couple of centuries BCE, and stuff we would never know. I mean, we knew something about the Herods and so forth, but there's just all kinds of interesting information about Pontius Pilate and so forth. And so it's an invaluable resource. And why did he write this stuff? Well, he was trying to encourage fellow Jews to be proud of their heritage, even though they had been dispersed by the Romans and defeated and all that. And he said, look, you got a lot to be proud of. And for Gentiles, Greeks and Romans, he said, don't despise Jews. We have a glorious heritage, and here it is. So he wrote all this stuff in eloquent Greek, very well educated. And the other reason the reason, let me say, he's controversial is that there is a passage in the Antiquities of the Jews where he's talking about the affronts that Pontius Pilate made against the Jews. There's several episodes about what an anti-Semite and a creep this guy was. And he says, this is more or less what it reads almost verbatim, about this time there appeared a man named Jesus, if indeed it is proper to call him a man, a mere man, for he did wonders and taught wisdom to those hungry to hear it, and he attracted to himself many of our people and also many of the Gentiles. He was arrested by Pilate at the instigation of the chief men among us, but those who loved him were not abandoned by him because he appeared to them 3 days later, and accordingly he was the Christ about whom these and many other prophecies spoke. And the tribe of Christians named after him continues to this day. That's pretty much it. Well, this would certainly slay the Christ myth theory, people have said for many decades. You see, here he is in a non-Christian source, a non-biblical source. Well, if that were true, I mean, if Josephus actually wrote such a thing, that wouldn't really help, because if Jesus really died around 30, and this man is writing 60 years later, there's no way he's reporting on anything other than what Christians were saying in his day, so it really doesn't help. But people thought it would. I mean, that's almost like saying if you find that there's an article about Jesus in the Encyclopedia Britannica, then he must have existed. But it turns out it's almost certain, I would say it is certain, that this has been penciled into the text by a Christian who just felt, well, gee, this is odd. They're leaving out one of the major events of the time. To complete it, I think I'll pencil this in on the margin. Or somebody might have decided to do it as a kind of a pious trick. Who knows? But it certainly seems to be a Christian interpolation. And so it's not only fundamentalists that like to point to this and insist that it really was written by this first century historian, but there are a lot of mainstream, generally critical New Testament scholars who will argue that, well, all right, a Jew could not have said Jesus was the Messiah. That's out of the question. You wouldn't have a Jew, unless he was a Christian, saying that Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies. Okay, yeah, there's a problem with that. But maybe Christians just inserted those little bits. Maybe Josephus did speak about Jesus as a teacher and a miracle worker, and that he was put to death, and that some said they saw him rise later. Well, that doesn't really work, because if you cut out the "he was the Christ," you can't really say the tribe of Christians descended from him and named after him continues to this day. That might have been the Jesuits, because he mentions Jesus in this abridged form. And it turns out almost certainly it's based on the 24th chapter of Luke. All kinds of interesting studies have shown there's just no way this is authentic. And there's similar problems with a later mention of the martyrdom of one James, the brother of the one called Jesus, brother of Jesus called the Christ. And I say, well, even if the other one is spurious, I mean, this has got to get you to admit that Jesus must really have existed. But there's problems in the context, knowing whether he's talking about Jesus and James from the Gospels, or Jesus and James, the sons of Damnius, who were claimants for the office of the high priest. And the high priest was also known as the Anointed, since they anointed him to inaugurate them. So that's a pretty weak read to build your confidence on the historical Jesus. And I think it's just a dead end and ought to be dropped.
Last question. Is the question of was there a real man Jesus? Is that worth our time? Are we wasting our time? Does it matter? What do you think?
I just find it an interesting and challenging historical question. I don't know if it matters at all if William Shakespeare actually wrote all those plays, and I haven't even read them all, so I have no opinion on it. But is the world going to change if they were to find copies that said Francis Bacon on the bottom? No, but it's just sort of a fascinating puzzle. I think it would be a severe jolt to Christianity if you could somehow prove Jesus didn't exist, but unless some real strange thing turns up, that'll never happen. And even if it did, people would just kind of laugh it off. But certainly more interesting to me than a lot of current events. And I'm just fascinated by it. I probably wouldn't be had I not been an evangelical Christian for about a dozen years. But I just find it interesting. And even after I left that, I still believe there must have been a historical Jesus. And the more I learned about the Christ myth business, the more astonished I was to find that the arguments seemed to be pretty compelling. But, it's not an open and shut case.